This video is sponsored by Brush Galaxy. Okay, we're in September now. We're on the approach to Halloween, so I thought it would be a really nice thing to draw a spider for today's tutorial. Now, I'm not a big fan of spiders as such. They used to scare me as a child, but I think they're a really cool thing to be able to draw. And yeah, it's just suitable for this time of year. So I'm using the app Procreate and an iPad and Apple Pencil. Within the brushes, I'm using the 6B pencil within sketching, and ignore the colors that I've got pre-selected here for my last tutorial. The color I'm going to be using, it doesn't matter on the actual color disc what the color is really. It's more about where it is within the center area. So I've not got it quite to the black at the bottom there. I've just spun it round to a dark grey. And it means it's really just like a charcoal. So that's perfect, just like a pencil. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to draw a circle. Now it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect circle, but it's roughly a circular shape. And this is going to be the spider's abdomen. Above that, we're going to do a smaller circle. And it's going to join in at this point here on top of that bigger circle. And we can always get rid of that section of the circles, not a problem. Go back to our pencil. We're going to have some little fangs here at the front. I'm going to do this as a black widow spider mainly. This is roughly based on that shape. So we've got this nice round body and the proportions will roughly match that spider. And then we're going to have what's called the pedipalps or the palps. They're going to be either side here. And they look like mini legs, but they're not actually really legs. Then from this thorax, which is this upper part of the main body, and this is also where the eyes and things are going to go. Though we won't see the eyes because by the time we add shading, there's no point. But this thorax, this upper part of the body, is where the legs are going to start growing from. So we just need to do some, if I zoom in, some little sections where the legs are stemming from. But they start with this shorter shape and then they kind of plug into this and grow outwards from there. So we need space. And I'll just rub that out a little bit just to make it extra clear what is a line and what isn't. And then, so we start with the two upper ones, make sure you've got room for the top and the bottom one, and then we can add two extra ones in there. Okay, so I'm going to do two quite long sections here at the front, growing from there. So do one that side, and then obviously the matching one on this side. Now, I'm not trying to get it too symmetrical. If it looks a little bit asymmetric, as long as the lengths look pretty much the same, then we don't need it to be symmetrical because obviously the spider can have its legs spaced and placed in a slightly different way on each side. So we can just initially add a little bit of shading in there just to really help us identify where the legs are and where the gaps are. So just some light to mid shading just to block it in. We don't want to lose the separation points though. Maybe almost like where it plugs in, you get almost like you've got a bulbous section being cupped like this at the joint. So much like you would get with bones. I mean, it is like an exoskeleton, isn't it? So you might get more of that kind of shape. Now I'm going to do a longer one for the top and bottom. So to do a nice long shape here as well. Again, let's block it in. And I'm going to do a matching one over on this side. Just try and match up the lengths more than anything, like I say. Again, we've almost got this cup. Just going to match with the joints. A little bit wide though, perhaps. So let's narrow that down. If it ends up slightly different lengths, well then the position of the leg can change the appearance of the lens. So actually, as long as it's not too dramatically different, you can get away with a slight variation there too. Again, let's add some slight shading to it. And let's think about the next two legs now. So we can almost, as I was just showing you here, we've got almost this where it grows into that. So we can exaggerate that shape. Now we know what it is. Perhaps we can just go in there and create a little bit of a dip. And then from those, we can create the next section, slightly shorter perhaps for these two. I'm going to zoom back out a little bit, just check the legs, make sure they're working. And then from these sections, I'm just going to start building out the next section of the leg. So again, a little dip almost for the next bit of the leg, and then we'll take it up. And then at the very end, there's just a little small piece. So you can see we've got four main sections, a little bit at the end, and then three larger pieces. So I'll just make sure we've got that on both sides, something like this. I do think that perhaps that's a little bit too thick at the top, so let's make that a little bit narrower, because actually looking at some images, I I think it does get a little bit narrower for that last section. We do the same again. Something like this. And then this one could be going slightly different directions. And then the last one is going to be curving down to complete that overall spider looking shape. A little piece on the end there as well. Obviously it's digital. If it's not quite landed in the center, we can just move it with the transform tool. So once we've got this, we can start just zooming in, just fine tuning some of these edges. So we want the outside edge of these shapes to be darker, and then just narrow down the lighter section so it looks like a sheen, like a shine that's reflecting light back for those center bits. But we don't want too much of it, so we can really darken it down somewhat at this point. So we don't want the middle bit to be bright white, so I'm adding a light tone to all of it and then just darkening up the edges like this. And then for this last section, last couple of sections at the top, we're not really going to see much light in the center at all. And we can do the same for each of those legs. So darken up on that outer edge, a little bit of light left in the middle, but not too bright. So let's dampen it down a little bit with some light shading. And then let's go up to the next section. Shade it in lightly, darken up the outside edges so it really starts to close it down. And then we did want this section to be quite thin with a little spindly bit at the top. You can always go back in with the eraser just to shave off some of the thickness on these parts if necessary. And if that last little piece isn't articulated well enough, then we can just rub it out and maybe just change the angle so it's really noticeable like that. I'm not using complicated brushes, but if you want to try out different brushes, then I suggest checking out Brush Galaxy. It's a brilliant brush subscription website service with over 20,000 premium Procreate brushes. You can save over 90% of the cost by subscribing and paying monthly, and it's got tons of different categories such as portrait, pattern, texture, nature, and loads more. If you subscribe today, you get the first 7 days free. You can unlock up to 12 brush packs for free, worth over $300. The links are in the comments and also the video description. And we're going to continue working on all of that, applying the same basics. Let's go to the thorax as well. Now the thorax is slightly different. It's not a completely round shape. Now, from what I've been observing, it's almost like it's pinched in at the center. So from that point, you can create almost like a V shape. It's actually split down the middle like this. You can even shade in the fangs too. Just give them a little bit of darkness. And then from there, you almost get some strange divisions coming in there like that as well. It's all going to be a lot darker than this, so you can shade it in generally. But because you've added those divisions and they're still there, you can perhaps exaggerate them a little bit, shade from them outwards, just thicken up those lines a little bit, and maybe just increase the shading in that center bit as well, and almost where it joins too. And I'm just going around the edge in addition to that, like so. And then obviously we've got the main abdomen, which is circular, but it is also going to have a slight point where it reaches the bottom, and this is obviously where it's spin its web from. So you don't need to exaggerate it too much. It's just a slight bump at the bottom, slight almost pinching at the bottom, and that will do. And we can add shading as a general all over, just slightly the side of the pencil on this brush setting will do that. And we'll just do it from another angle too. And I'm going to just thicken it up slightly around this edge. And then at the top section, I'm going to add quite a bit more darkness too. Again, just go around this edge. Just do it gradually, build it up. Maybe just add a bit more shading here. I'm going to go over it all again with one extra layer just to darken the whole thing up just a little bit more. I might go back into that and add just a little bit more of highlights, just more of a sense of a sheen. But we've got the fundamentals there to work with. So that's creating the overall shape. Perhaps just a little bit more darkness around that edge just to help the sense that it really is more rounded. So increase that dark edge into the center just a little bit more perhaps. And I'll come back to that, but I'm just going to continue with the legs just to make sure that they're complete. And part of this effect is going to be the shadow that we're going to add last of all. Again, these thin bits at the end, we can always reduce the shape of those down with the eraser again, just to really thin them out. Fine tune some of these shapes. Again, make sure none of it is pure white. Let's thicken up the edges. We must make sure to shade in these palps or pedipalps as well. Maybe just reduce some of the light as these legs come closer to the spider's body, like this. We'll come back to that. We'll add a little few more fine tuning touches, but we're going to add some shadow as well. Now for this, I suggest you turn the opacity down to about 10%, so it's going to be really light and it's going to be really useful. So before, the size of the brush was 40% and we had about 50% opacity, but now it's turned down, still the same size of 40% size, but it's now at 10% opacity. So we're going to add some shadows. Let's imagine the light's obviously coming from above, and we'll start with a shadow where it joins the foot, and it's going to be quite dark at the point where it joins. But then as it moves further away, it's going to soften off and lighten. And then perhaps it will darken up again when it rejoins nearer the body. So we can have a thickening off or thickening up of the shadow once it moves away from that point where it joins, but it gets lighter, and then when it joins again, it's going to get darker and thinner. Let's pick another one that's going to be quite straightforward. So we've got a point where it joins there, and then it's going to come underneath. The point where it joins there, it's going to be quite nice and dark, but then it thins off. It's going to follow the rough shape, obviously, but it is going to thin off so you don't even see it. And then we've got another one here. Try and imagine where the light's coming from. So it's from above, but it's almost like from this direction. So that works fine for this one, but for this one, because of the angle, you might not see all of the shadow. It might roughly go behind at this point, but it will start to creep round on this side. So you'll see where it joins over here, but then it gets fainter, and then you don't see where the shadow is actually underneath that part of the leg perhaps. And then we'll do this one. So again, light's coming from up here. This one's going to be quite dramatic. You'll see where it joins, but it's lifted off in this section perhaps, and therefore we're going to get a bigger gap between the shadow and the actual leg. Now I'm keeping it quite slight at the minute, quite a subtle shadow. We can always go back into it and just exaggerate it a little bit if we need to. So again, the light's coming from this part, so you might see where it joins, and the shadow might go underneath, and then you might just see the bottom part of it join here as well. So a slightly confused shadow on this side, but some of them it's going to be super clear. So this one should be clearer. Joins at that bit, then it comes down here, and then it joins back there again. And then this one, again, sharp and dark where it joins, then pretty much disappears actually until we get closer to it again over here. And then here it's going to be less obvious. Perhaps it's actually going to curve this side of it, because think where the shadow is going to fall. It's catching the light here and it casts its shadow over here. So darker where it joins, and then it almost like it diffuses off, it spreads off like so. So we can just zoom in a little bit. Perhaps the point at which it joins, we can go over it a few times. It's only on 10%, so we can keep going over it quite a few times, and it's not really going to drastically impact our image. So I'm just going to thicken up the shadow actually to make it a little bit more diffused. We've done all of this on one layer. Perhaps we could have done it on a different layer and even used the Gaussian blur or something like that. But actually, because it's on such a low opacity, I think we can manage to add this soft effect anyway without using the tools. So again, just sharpen it up, make it a bit darker with a point where it touches, and then have it go over it a few times, soften it up in the middle sections. So go over it a few times here, sharpen it up, and the point where it touches over here as well. We can really darken that point up. We can do that all the way. Point where it joins back up with the body, it's going to be darker because there's much closer between the object and the shadow, so it gets a darker shadow at that point. And then further away, you get a lighter shadow, and then when it touches again, makes contact with the surface, it's darker again. And we'll just repeat that a little bit more for the remaining legs. And that will do for the shadow, but we're just going to go back in now and just refine a little bit. So I'm on the eraser. The eraser is still on a medium brush. It doesn't really matter. You could put it actually, if you go from the pencil and long press the eraser, now the eraser is the 6B, which will work pretty well actually. So we'll do that, although it doesn't really matter. We're going to zoom in just a little bit. On this top edge of the circle, we're just going to create a little bit more of a highlight at the top, just to really define that top edge of that abdomen section. And we can also just give a little bit more of a definition around the edge of the thorax too, in places, just to sharpen it up a little bit more. Now, considering where the light's coming from, so it's coming up there, so you are going to get a slight more lighter definition on this edge perhaps, but not too much. Maybe just a little bit of a highlight perhaps. Now I'm going to keep it quite rough and quite textured, imagining that the spider is not smooth, but it has almost like a textured surface like hair where it's breaking up that sheen really. So again, on some of these strange little folds and creases here, you could just add a little bit more of a highlight. Go back in with the brush. I put it back up to the 50% opacity just to darken up perhaps a little bit more of this top section. Perhaps just almost like a secondary light coming in here as well. Just helps really sell the roundness of it, but just carefully with this. So it's not on the very edge, it's just a little bit set back from the edge. So you've still got a dark edge, and then just a little bit of that lightness is creeping in just around here, just to help sell the illusion that it is a round shape. Okay, I'm going to leave this tutorial here at this point. If you've enjoyed following along and you've had a go at doing it too, make sure to share your version with me. I've got some links down in the video description for my Instagram and a Facebook group, and you can share them with me there. If you haven't already pressed the bell notification, make sure to do that, and I shall catch you back here soon. See you later.